Sightlines, a Stadium Odyssey. Written and read by Simon Inglis. Part 1. Back to the Garden. Sightlines is the term architects use to describe the quality of view that a spectator has of the action, either over or between the heads of the spectators sitting in front. Now, in order to make the calculations required to provide quality sightlines, the following formula is used. Listen carefully. N equals R plus C times D plus T minus R all over D. Unfortunately, I was never very good at maths, so instead this is how I would describe my view. I would say that, on balance, much as I like sport, I prefer stadiums. There is, however, one fundamental aspect of a stadium's allure, beyond definitions, measurements or formulas, that I would dearly like to understand more fully, for I'm certain that few sports fans in the world do not, consciously or subconsciously, share my predilection. Male ones, at least. And what's more, I think we might need help. Anton Chekhov once wrote, "What a luxurious thing nature is! I could just take her and eat her up." I know just what he means. Scene 1. Chelmsford, Essex, circa 1960. Every summer, my brother, sister and I would leave Birmingham to stay with Uncle Bill and Auntie Frida in their small village just outside Chelmsford. Bill, a jovial, ruddy-faced Glaswegian, lectured at the local agricultural college and liked to bring his experiments home. Frida, also Scottish, was a teacher and an all-round good egg. They had no children of their own and were the last people in Essex to buy a television. One Saturday afternoon, when I was 5 or 6 years old, Frida took us to a park in Chelmsford, where by the by we saw in the distance some green corrugated fencing. From our side of this fencing we could hear vague rumblings from a crowd. As we moved nearer, through gaps in the fence, I caught glimpses of an expanse of turf. Although in my mind's eye this encounter has no doubt become idealised over the years, I am certain that at that moment something clicked. This was my first experience of a football ground. That sensation of standing on the outside of a secret paradise, of wanting desperately to go in, has never left me. Nor has the memory of that Chelmsford ground, turf on the outside, turf on the inside, public space and private space, separated by a humble green corrugated fence. It was around that time, too, that I began to understand what Uncle Bill did for a living. Apart from going on about the downtrodden workers, Bill talked also about nitrates and soil and the importance of feeding the starving masses. His greenhouse was filled with dozens of tiny pots, each one growing a few blades of grass. Scene 2. Birmingham, circa 1969. From my bedroom window, I enjoyed perfect sightlines into the gardens of both our neighbours' houses. On our left lived a Mr. Lammy. One day I saw him, head down, kneeling on a rubber mat in the middle of his impeccable lawn. With a pair of small scissors, he was painstakingly trimming the top of each rogue blade of grass that had dared to grow too big for its roots. As an adolescent with attitude, with shoulder-length hair and Captain Beefheart croaking on my Dansette record player, "It's the blimp, Frank, it's the blimp!" I suppose I should have reviled boring old Mr. Lambie for his bourgeois obsession, and yet I thought of him as a solitary craftsman. What he was doing, what he was trying to achieve, did not seem to me at all perverse. After all, his lawn often looked better than the pitch at Villa Park. Scene 3. Lord's Cricket Ground, London, circa 1987. It was the end of a NatWest final, I think. A good day's cricket in the late summer having provided a welcome respite from the clamour of football. I've always been far too polite to invade a pitch at the end of a football match, but at cricket grounds, strolling onto the pitch after the final ball is, more or less, an accepted and acceptable ritual. For the cognoscenti in particular, it offers a chance to inspect the wicket as closely as the ropes will allow, to gather around that strip of shaven turf as if enjoined in a spiritual pilgrimage. Now, for those of you who have never experienced the sensation of stepping onto a perfectly manicured expanse of turf, that first contact between the soles of one's shoes and the turf is a uniquely sensual moment. Indeed, it is a hard-hearted individual who does not reach down at that same moment and stroke the finely cut grass, if only to gain proof that it is indeed real and not some artful substitute. To run one's fingers along the tips and crinkly edges of finely meshed blades of grass, to feel their evenness on the palm of one's hand, is to cross the line between distant admiration and intimate appreciation. I go further. I doubt if any spectator can genuinely empathise with a player until he or she has stood on a perfect playing surface and felt its slight give, its subtle spring. To feel this under one's feet, and at the same time to be caressed by the circulating air, to be enwrapped by the all-pervading aromatic sense of place, the genius loci, as it is so aptly called, is to be touched to the core by man's inestimable ability to make the very best of this beautiful, fearful, contrary world. Coming to this discovery for the first time at Lord's, on that late summer evening, I knew exactly what I had to do. I took off my shoes and socks and felt the short grass caress the soles of my bare feet. A friend who was with me at the time laughed, but I was not alone in doing this. Others were taking off their shoes too. But among them, I realized I was the only male. Some say that to walk barefoot through grass is subconsciously to seek a return to the innocence of the Garden of Eden before the fall. If so, it is as well that Adam was joined by Eve rather than Steve. For with no other distractions, the two men would probably have pottered about on the grass all day, and in the evening built themselves a garden shed. But Adam was distracted, and ever since, we men have been trying to get ourselves back to the garden. What is it, I wondered that evening at Lord's, about men and grass? Scene 4. A groundsman's hut in Melbourne, 1998. Most people have their own favourite bit of the typical behind-the-scenes stadium tour. Maybe the hush of the oak-panelled boardroom or the clinical sparseness of the liniment-scented dressing rooms. But the tours seldom lead visitors to the best part of the stadium, the groundsman's hut, his lair, his hideaway. If you can manage to track it down, and if he will talk, for these guys are not hired for their sociability, you can learn more from a groundsman about the heart and soul, and the light and dark of a stadium than from anyone else. Frank, sunburned and dusty in a groundsman's hut in suburban Melbourne, was only too happy to natter with an inquisitive pom over a cold drink and a fag, as he sat me down on a fertiliser sack amid all the paraphernalia of his profession. So happy, in fact, that after a 15-minute monologue on creeping fescues, perennial ryegrasses and silica sands, I had to remind him gently that I was no turf expert, only an interested admirer. "Yeah," conceded Frank ruefully, "the groundsman's lot can be a pretty lonely one at times." The groundsman, he explained, spends most of his week out there in the middle as the ruler of his patch, the master of his universe, but then promptly disappears the moment the actors file onto his stage. Some groundsmen I have met can't even bear to watch a game. Instead, they brood in the recesses of the stadium like an anxious parent waiting for the kids to vacate the living room before emerging to survey the damage. To catalogue the routine tasks of a groundsman is to be reminded of how rooted are our field sports in the rhythms and vagaries of the natural world. Seeding, dressing the topsoil, solid tining, brushing and harrowing, levelling, fertilising, pricking, spiking and raking, irrigation and scarification, mow and roll, row and mole. So much planning is needed, so much patience, always waiting for the right moment, not too wet, not too dry. Tease out the thatch, get air to the roots, sand slitting, sand grooving, subsoiling, mole ploughing. And then finally, when no more can be done than to pray, laying down the white lines, the lines that lend the turf its true definition.